Today I want to take you to Isaiah chapter 51, and I'm going to read it for you right now. Just the first 3 verses. Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness and who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were cut, and to the quarry from which you were hewn. Look to Abraham your father and to Sarah who gave you birth. When I called him, he was only one man, and I blessed him and made him many. The Lord will surely comfort Zion and will look with compassion on all her ruins. He will make her deserts like Eden, her wastelands like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and sound of singing. Now, I will say that I have actually never spoken from this passage in in Isaiah chapter 51 before. But there's a disclaimer I need to acknowledge. I am going to do a variation of this 5 days from now at Grace Pasadena Church when our son Anders and his wife Ashley consecrate their daughter to God. So I'm a grandfather. This happened to be last summer. Her name is Charlotte, and she looks like this. I knew we'd get some ahs out of that. And here she is with her parents, both of them Biola graduates from, 8 or so years ago. But you'll like this. Charlotte Marie Corey is her name. And when I read this passage that says, look to Sarah who gave you birth, look to the quarry from which you were hewn, I'm going to actually say, look to the quarry from which you were hewn. I'm just testing this one right on you if it's going to work. Because I actually don't know that audience there, and so I figured I'd get a little bit of reaction from you. I'm not sure now if I'm going to use that one. But I do trust you, so if it doesn't work, I'm going to blame you. So this chapter begins with an imperative. The imperative is, listen to me. And an imperative for you, like grammar geeks like me, means you start with the verb, right? And then you don't need the noun because it's implied. It's implied in an imperative that the noun is you, right? So if my wife, Paula, and I are out on a walk, and she says, hey, look at that egret. I know she's like basically saying that to me because sometimes I'm oblivious, but I know she's not saying, look at that egret to anybody else. She's saying, hey, you, me, look at that egret. So that's an imperative. And as a good husband, it's imperative for me to look at that egret. So when Isaiah says, listen to me, he's saying to his audience, you listen to me. Remember your days as children when your mother or father rivetingly looked at you and said those 3 words, listen to me. When they said that, they had something to say. They said, listen to me to disrupt your inattention because they had something for your good that they wanted you to hear, and whatever they wanted you to hear was coming next. So when my parents began that trinity of words to me, those 3, listen to me, I know they had something to say, and they often said that to me. And usually when they said that, actually they weren't laughing. And we parents say, listen to me, because our children often aren't listening. And there's something that they want to say and want us to hear. And when you get to the end of the 3rd verse, which we're going to do in a few minutes, you'll see why Isaiah, in this rather curt, father-like way, was asking them to listen to him. Because he needed to get their attention, and it was for their own good. So this passage begins with those 3 words, listen to me, followed by a colon. Now, grammar geeks like the colon knows that there's something that's going to come after the colon that's a list of things that connect to what was just said. So what comes after the colon? Well, it's another imperative. He says, look to the rock, to the quarry from which you were hewn. Now, when was the last time you actually said hewn? Actually, it's funny I said when, because if you readjust the letters of when, it spells hewn. So that's another, too much anagram in me. But I don't actually think we say hewn enough. And hewn, it's not said that much in the Bible. This is actually the only place, I believe, you'd have to ask one of these scholars here, but I believe, I looked, it's the only place in the Bible where the word hewn is used, right here in Isaiah chapter 51. And hewn means to shape something, right? By cutting, like wood or a stone, with a purpose in mind to make something beneficial out of that which is hewn. So there's a difference between hewing and hacking, okay? To hew is not to hack. Let me just say that. Hewing has a purpose to make something like more useful or more beautiful. And hacking is this reckless and purposeless word. Like you can hew a bench out of a fallen tree trunk. Right? You can hew a quarry to find a piece of marble, and out of that piece of marble to chisel into that a sculpture. Bible students, this is not saying to you, look to the quarry from which you were hacked. You are not hacked. Your computer might have been hacked, but you're not hacked. You're hewn. And it's actually a more pleasant sounding word, I think, anyway. And you're not hacked recklessly out of something. You're hewn beautifully into something. You are painstakingly chiseled out of something bigger and grander and transparent and eternal and glorious into the beautiful image-bearing person you are, bearing the image of God. Look to the rock, Isaiah says, from which you are hewn, not hacked. And I have to think that those listeners to Isaiah back in the day understood his opening lines when he says, look to the rock from which you were hewn. And I thought it was so appropriate today. We sang that song, Rock of Ages, oh Rock of Ages, you're so faithful. For when Isaiah says, like, folks, you were sculpted out of a rock, they got it. Because they had been listening to what Isaiah had been saying for a very long time in his earlier poetic words about the rock, and not Dwayne Johnson, the rock. That's not the rock I'm talking about. Not him. Get him out of the picture. It's like another rock he's talking about. Because in chapter 17, Isaiah says, for you have forgotten the God of your salvation, and you have not remembered the God of your refuge, who is the rock. Chapter 26, trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord our God is an everlasting rock. Chapter 32, each of you will find a hiding place and shade by the great rock in a weary land. Chapter 44, is there any God besides me? There is no rock, but the Lord, I know not any. And then the last time, very last time that Isaiah uses the word rock, that powerful metaphor, that powerful image, in his beautiful poetry is right there in chapter 51. Isaiah is saying, all of those times that I've been telling you about God who is the rock, this is the image you bear, and you have been chiseled out of him. And they got what Isaiah meant. That rock from which you are hewn is the same rock that's a refuge in chapter 17. It's the same rock that's everlasting in chapter 26. It's the same rock that's a shade in a weary land in chapter 32. It's the same rock that is the rock of ages in chapter 44. And Isaiah is getting across a message that if you are in a weary land, if you are feeling scorched and pummeled, if you are beleaguered today at the end of your semester and exhausted, or maybe if you've clung to too many small R rocks that have let you down, or may have given you this fleeting sense of security, then maybe it's time not just to consider God as the rock of ages, but maybe it's time for you to consider that you have been hewn from this big R rock. You are not the rock. You're more like a rockette, right? Cut from the rock, the cornerstone, who is Christ. And that should give you reassuring perspective. You are not a random pebble. You are hewn from a rock, chiseled wonderfully and fearfully from a holy quarry. So take a breath in that at the end of this maybe beleaguering semester, because if you see things from this perspective, it's life-giving. After my junior year in college, I traveled for a chunk of the summer with a little money that I inherited from my grandmother through Europe by train. I was on the cheap. I kept carrying with me Arthur Frommer's Europe on what was then $10 a day. And near the end of my travels that summer, I boarded a ferry from Stavanger, Norway, to Newcastle, England. And there in Newcastle, I would buy a train ticket to train from Newcastle down to London, where I'd fly home 9 countries later, and then return to college for my senior year. And I remember that day getting on that train that was quickly filling up when I stepped into the coach class car. And only a few seats were left, and I sat beside this older British man, balding and tweeded and bespectacled and just looking so dapper. And he was holding on his lap that day's edition of the Times, London's most respected daily newspaper. And featuring stories on the front page of that paper were the political tensions between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, tensions that were escalating into hostilities and protests and violence. And we hadn't been traveling long before this gentleman turned to me, and it was the first that either of us had talked to one another, and he directed my sight outside of the window beside him on the train and east of us, spanning the good part of a hillside, was a giant horse carved in rock, looking like this. And I don't know, it could have been, from my perspective, the length of a football field, European or American. And pointing to the headline, the political disputes that were above the fold there in the Times front page, and then looking at that horse hewn out of that mountain rock, he said, "Isn't it a shame how we worry and fret over these petty matters when that horse has remained on the side of that hill for more than 100 years? And 100 years from now, that horse will still be there." I think I answered him with that rhetorical question. I thought it was a real question. I was yeah, it is a shame, or, yeah, good point. I don't remember some inane comment that I had. But the conversation ended, and train continued, and that was pretty much all that was said on our trip back then. We went to our solo routines, and I got to that rented room that night, pulled out my journal, which I still have, and I thought about that elderly man's words. And that night, lying in the bed, I thought of the man on the train and the horse carved out of rock on that English hillside. And I had an epiphany that I am part of something far bigger than whatever the challenges du jour are. And I'm not alone, as much as I was feeling it. I'm part of something bigger, something enduring, something vast. I'm not just a child of a quarry. I'm a child of a quarry. And I thought that night, and I have thought many times since, isn't it a shame how we worry and fret over these petty matters when that rock has been there for a very long time, and that rock will be there for a very long time. So that's why Isaiah is saying to his listeners then and now, listen to me. Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness and who seek the Lord. Isaiah is saying, you are a chip off the old block. You are a rock hewn from the rock of ages. You are not a random nugget or a hacking from a boulder. You are made in God's image, quarried by God himself. Therefore, verse 3, and this is what Isaiah is saying to listen and look for. This is what he's getting at. He said, the Lord will surely comfort you. He will look with compassion on what you see as your ruins. He will make your deserts become like fertile lands, your wastelands like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in you, thanksgiving and the sound of singing. Isaiah knew they needed to hear that by trusting in God, they would find comfort in their anxiousness, compassion in their loneliness, provision in their emptiness, and joy in their sadness. And maybe today you find yourself in verse 3. God, I am in need of some comfort right now because I'm afflicted in spirit. God, I need some compassion right now because I'm feeling unloved and spent. God, I am parched, and my soul is like a wasteland, a thirsty desert. God, joy and gladness and thanksgiving have been sucked from me. And you long for comfort and compassion and a quenched thirst and joy and gladness. Feeling this way? Parts of me are. So then I go back to verse 1. And look to the rock from which you were hewn, for you are preciously sculptured and chiseled by God out of his quarry, and he calls you beautiful and fearfully and wonderfully made. Maybe the band can come up here and start playing something spiritual. I'm about to be done right here. So get you guys out of here a little bit earlier. But how does this passage in Isaiah 51 begin? He says, listen, you are God's sculpture. And how does this passage in Isaiah 51 end? He says, listen, for the sound of singing is coming. Joy and gladness will be found in you. Thanksgiving and the sound of singing will be found in you. It's what another prophet named Zephaniah wrote in his final verses. Do not let your hands hang limp. The Lord your God is with you. He's mighty to save. He will take great delight in you. He will quiet you with his love, and he will rejoice over you with singing. This God whose image you embody, this God who carved you as a precious sculpture hewn from his everlasting quarry, this God who calls you his covenant daughter and covenant son, this God who beckons you to pursue righteousness with him, this God who continues his promises from generation to generation, this God who comforts the bereft and quenches the thirsty and relieves the suffering and has compassion on the lonely and provides for the wanting and turns mourning into dancing. This God sings over you, Biola University. And this passage begins with words calling us to righteousness and to seek the Lord. This passage goes on to assure us that we have been hewn from God's quarry and are children of God's covenant. This passage declares to us that God will therefore care for us in our desert places. And this passage ends with a lullaby, calming our childlike fears and fussiness with these words: joy and gladness will be found in you. Thanksgiving and the sound of singing will be found in you. And this passage that ends with the promise of a song also points to the great closing verses of Scripture, reminding us that at the end of the day, when our generation passes from glory to glory, it all ends in a song. And hear this song. from Revelation chapter 5. And the saints in heaven, they sang a new song. Christ, you're worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals because you were slain. And with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation, and you have made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth. Amen and amen.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.